Hand-dyed yarn is beautiful until it isn't. You spend weeks knitting a sweater only to end up with a strange color line where you switched skeins or some blotches of pooling in all the wrong places. But don't worry, in this video I'll explain the 3 most common mistakes people make when knitting with hand-dyed yarn and how to avoid them. Plus I'll share the different types of hand-dyed yarn so you know exactly what you're working with, like speckled yarn, variegated yarn or tonal yarn, for example. The yarns that I am showing you in this video have all been dyed with natural dyes, but everything that I talk about in this video also applies to hand-dyed yarn that has been dyed with synthetic acid dyes. Let's get started. The biggest mistake you can make when knitting with hand-dyed yarn is to knit straight through one skein and then once this skein is knitted up, simply switch to the next skein. And this very often can result in a visible color line. Even if 2 skeins look almost identical, no 2 skeins of hand-dyed yarn are exactly the same, and there is a very simple solution to this issue, and this is to simply alternate skeins when you knit with hand-dyed yarn. And I'm going to show you an example where I did exactly that. This shawl is Boho Blush by Andrea Mowry, and I knitted it with a yarn that I dyed myself using cochineal. And I alternated skeins. So I used 2 skeins in total and I knitted 2 rows, so back and forth with one skein, and then I simply switched to the other skein and then I knitted back and forth again and so on. I'm not sure if the camera is going to pick it up, but in real life you can, if you look close, see a color difference in the skeins. I think if you look from afar, it looks nice and blended. There is a little bit of movement in it, but I think if I would have just knitted with the one skein first and then attached the second one, you would for sure see a visible line where I switched skeins. And because I alternated skeins, you cannot really see that. It just looks just a bit like a tonal yarn, and this is an effect that I personally quite like, and I am very happy with how this shawl turned out. I also did the same for this one here. This is the Fleur shawl, a free pattern by Espace Tricot, and I did exactly the same. I used a hand-dyed yarn and naturally dyed this colorway using cochineal again, but in a higher concentration. That's why this one is so much more vibrant than this light blush pink one. And I simply alternated skeins, so knitting 2 rows back and forth with the one skein and then alternating and using the other skein. Another mistake is not understanding which kind of yarn you are buying. And the yarn terminology really matters here because it will tell you what to expect when knitting with the yarn. These are examples for solid or semi-solid colors. They look almost uniform but have some subtle tonal shifts. Those types of yarns are great for garments and lace. Everything where you want to have an even color distribution all throughout one piece. Here we have an example of a tonal yarn. It contains multiple shades of the same color within this one skein. It adds depth to the yarn without being too busy. This is an example for a speckled skein of yarn. You can see those little bursts or specks of color that are scattered across the yarn. It creates this very fun confetti look. And here is another example how the speckled skein of yarn looks knitted up. This is a sock. This is one of my own sock designs called the Happiness All Around Socks, and I used a speckled colorway to knit this pair. Those are 2 examples of variegated yarns. These can pool dramatically if you are not careful, because variegated yarns consist of large patches of different colors. If you have never heard of the term pooling before, pooling basically means that you have large pools or blotches of color that gather in the same spot rather than creating a more random distribution throughout the yarn and then of course also the knitted fabric. And I have one pair of socks of my own to show you. This is the pattern I'm So Basic Socks by Summer Lee that I knitted using one of my own hand-dyed yarns. And as you might be able to tell exactly here, there is some color pooling going on. So you do not have this more even distribution, let me see, like you have in this speckled skein of yarn where the colors are more not even but randomly distributed. And here you have this gathering of the contrast color all in one place. Some people like this effect, others don't. Personally, I have to say in a sock I don't mind it at all, but it would bother me quite a bit if this would have happened in a sweater. And the solution here is very simple. You just have to alternate skeins. And if you do this, you can counteract the pooling effect. And there is another great technique called assigned pooling, where you work with the natural tendency of the yarn to pool instead of trying to counteract it. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of how patterns that embrace the assigned pooling can look like later on in the video. We of course also have the striped yarns when it comes to hand-dyed yarn. These yarns will create some stripes in your knitted fabric, but depending on the circumference of the garment or the knitted piece, the stripes will be thicker or thinner. For example, if you knit a sock with a smaller circumference, the stripes will naturally be thicker than compared to, let's say, a hat or a garment. And lastly, we have the gradient or ombre yarns. These types of yarns can either be monochrome or multicolored. In a single colored yarn, like you can see here, there is a change in the color value happening from one end of the skein to the other. For example, in this cake here, you have the light pink yarn on the outside, and towards the middle it gets darker and darker. And the same is true for this brown cake here that gets lighter towards the middle. You could also have a multicolored ombre yarn that shifts from one color to the other, and I'm going to put an example for you up on the screen so that you can imagine how that would look like. By the way, if you are fascinated by hand-dyed yarns and would love to give dyeing yarn yourself a try, I can only highly recommend that you do so. It is so much fun and not difficult at all. I have written a free guide that walks you through each of the steps of the yarn dyeing process on the example of a natural dye. In this example, I show you how to dye with onion skins, which you usually have at home as a type of kitchen waste anyway, so it's also a very sustainable way. If you would like to get this free guide, I'm going to put up a link for you both on the screen and in the description box. Because hand-dyed yarns are usually made in small batches, once they're gone, they're gone. And a big mistake is not buying enough yarn. And I know this from experience, but it can save you so much heartbreak if you just buy an extra skein. Because very often you cannot get the exact same colorway, and even if there are some hand dyers that are able to create extremely uniform results, it is still a process that's done by hand, and even if you get the same colorway, you could still experience some variance in the colorway itself. And especially when it comes to natural dyes, where there are so many factors influencing the final color result, it is very difficult to replicate exact colorways. So please always make sure to buy an extra skein of yarn. Let's talk about a few bonus tips now. If you want to have a smooth gradient effect, you could buy a fade set. There are so many beautiful sets available. I'm going to put one up on the screen for you just as an example. It also makes sense to pair more busy looking yarns with simple stitch patterns. I'm going to put another example for you on the screen, but I think this design called the So Faded by Andrea Mowry is a great example of that. And when in doubt, you can also always mix a colorful multicolored yarn with a tonal yarn in order to calm things down a bit. For example, if you have a look at those two together, so the solid yarn with the variegated yarn, I think this could look very beautiful. Or let's see, for example, these two, so the speckled yarn together with the tonal yarn would look very pretty as well, I imagine. Another possibility is to use an additional strand of a silk mohair yarn to hold all throughout the project in order to just blend things and tone them down a bit. I personally think that this looks very beautiful as well. And since I promised you to talk a bit more about the assigned pooling technique, I wanted to introduce you to Dawn Barker, who is an amazing knitwear designer and who has created several different knitting patterns that play with this assigned pooling. So if you have a look at this example, this is a shawl called Glide. And you can see that whenever the pooling started to appear, she created this little textured stitch that looks like a flower. And the end result is so stunning in my opinion. It looks like almost an embroidery that has been done on top of the shawl, but in reality it's just done by knitting and paying attention to the color development of the yarn. Hand-dyed yarn is truly a joy to knit with, as long as you know how to avoid these common mistakes that I just talked about. But once you do, I think it is so magical and so special knitting with the yarn that someone took the time to dye by hand. And if you would like to take hand dyeing yarn to the next level, I encourage you to download my free guide on how to dye your first skein using natural dyes, so you can truly experience this joy and magic yourself. And if you enjoyed this video, I think you will also like my video where I talked about the difference between natural dyes and synthetic acid dyes in more detail. I'm going to link this one for you on the screen, and see you next time. Happy making. Bye guys.